Very concerned by the PRC's provocative military activity near Taiwan.
After 2025, they will be fully prepared.
台湾问题纯属中国内政，不容任何外来干涉。
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment.
This is the Taiwan Strait, a 180-kilometer, 110-mile wide strip of water separating mainland China from Taiwan. And in the coming conflict, this small swath of ocean could see some of the bloodiest fighting since World War II. In the last few years, China has been strengthening its armed forces, expanding its 3 air bases closest to Taiwan, creating naval bases on man-made islands in the South China Sea, developing stealth fighters, and most important of all, growing their nuclear arsenal. One man and one island are at the center of a battle that could see the US drawn into direct conflict with another of the world's superpowers. China under Xi Jinping is more aggressive and more powerful. In 2017, at an event celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's official takeover of China, President Xi detailed his vision for what China plans to accomplish by 2049. One section stood out.
在中华大地上
Resolving the Taiwan question to realize China's complete reunification is the shared aspiration of all Chinese people, and is in the fundamental interest of the Chinese nation. With the world distracted by Russia's aggressions in Ukraine, China is secretly making moves to take back Taiwan and finally reunite the country. But to truly understand what's going on, we'll have to go back to when there weren't 2 governments vying for control of China.
China, August 1945. The defeat of the common enemy, Japan, finds key areas of China held firmly by the communists.
The roots of the current conflict were seated in the Chinese Civil War between the communists and nationalists. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan quickly withdrew, creating a power vacuum. This left these 2 rival factions in a scramble to control territory in China. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, won that brutal conflict, forcing Chiang Kai-shek's US-backed nationalists to flee to the island of Taiwan, then called Formosa. Initially, the US accepted the idea that Taiwan would eventually fall under communist control, and President Truman even refused to send military aid to support the nationalists. But after the Korean War, the US public was horrified that communist countries would never stop invading democracies, and so Truman sent the 7th Fleet to defend the Taiwan Strait and act as a deterrence against continued Chinese expansion. Fast forward to today, and Xi Jinping's CCP continues to threaten an invasion. But now, fears are growing in Washington that in the next few years, they may make good on those threats, potentially pulling the US into yet another international conflict. In September, Chinese aircraft repeatedly breached the median line in the Taiwan Strait, eliminating a de facto buffer zone that has kept the peace for decades. The party-run Global Times newspaper gave a picture of what could come, urging China's Air Force to patrol the skies over Taiwan and achieve reunification through military means if necessary. This from the official government newspaper. The United States has military commitments to defend 67 countries around the globe, but Taiwan isn't one of them. Instead, the US maintains what's known as strategic ambiguity. Declaring a formal alliance would anger officials in Beijing, but announcing the US wouldn't intervene would be like rolling out the red carpet for a Chinese invasion. So for decades, the US has gently straddled the line, never confirming what the US's response would be. That is, until President Biden said he would defend the island in a town hall last year.
That the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment.
Apart from symbolics, why would the US defend a foreign island smaller than all but 9 US states? A Chinese invasion could force the US to intervene to protect its global interests. Over the last 10 years or so, Taiwan has invested heavily in its capacity to manufacture computer chips. In particular, one single Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, produces half of all computer chips and more than 90% of high-end chips, the ones that go into advanced avionics, defense systems, and 5G networks. The world is already in the midst of a years-long chip shortage, and if the PRC were to take control of TSMC, that would set US markets back by at least a decade. This security threat of TSMC falling into Chinese hands is a big part of why the US lobbied so aggressively to have them build plants in the US, so that they can continue creating chips regardless of what happens in Taiwan. And if China seized control of Taiwan, that would give them even more control over one of the most vital shipping lanes on the planet. Most importantly, Taiwan is strategically positioned to contain Chinese forces. If China were to ever defeat Taiwan, they could project power into the Pacific Ocean, threatening US territories like Guam and Hawaii. And China is already preparing for this reality. The PLA Air Force released a video in September showing H-6 bombers making strikes on a mock-up runway of the ones at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, a key staging area for any US conflict in the Western Pacific. Another reason for the US's involvement is the relatively small amount of forces it would need to deploy to defend the country. Based on military exercises, arms purchases, and leaked strategic documents, we can game out scenarios for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Most of these foresee China going for a quick knockout, in which the PLA overwhelms the main island before the US could intervene. On paper, the military balance heavily favors Beijing. China spends about 25 times more in its military than Taiwan, and has a clear conventional edge on everything from missiles and fighter jets to warships and troop levels, not to mention its nuclear arsenal. China has also been preparing with mock invasions. In this satellite footage taken September 29th, we can see a Chinese military training complex in Inner Mongolia. Shown in this satellite image are full-scale replicas of key targets like Taiwan's presidential office building, major highways, and military bases. This leaked photo even shows a practice assault on the mock presidential office building. Here's a photo of the real one for comparison. Separate satellite images show mock versions of Taiwan's Qingking Air Base. Beijing's optimistic version of events goes something like this. Prior to an invasion, cyber and electronic warfare units would target Taiwan's financial system and key infrastructure, as well as US satellites to reduce notice of impending ballistic missiles. Airstrikes would quickly aim to kill Taiwan's top political and military leaders, while also immobilizing local defenses. The ground invasion would follow, with PLA warships and submarines traversing the Taiwan Strait. Outlying islands like Kinmen and Pratas could quickly be taken before a fight for the Penghu Archipelago, which sits just 50 kilometers from Taiwan and is home to bases of all three branches of its military. A PLA win here would provide it with a valuable staging point for a broader attack. As Chinese ships speed across the strait, thousands of paratroopers would appear above Taiwanese coastlines, looking to penetrate defenses, capture strategic buildings, and establish beachheads through which the PLA would bring in tens of thousands of soldiers who would secure a decisive victory. This is similar to the D-Day invasions of World War II. Keep in mind, this is China's ideal scenario. In reality, any invasion is likely to be much riskier. Taiwan's main island has many natural defenses. The island is surrounded by rough seas with unpredictable weather. Its rugged coastline offers only a few places with wide enough beaches suitable for large ships, and the country's mountainous terrain is riddled with tunnels designed to keep key leaders alive and could provide cover for insurgents if China established control. Not to mention, those few landing beaches are covered with military fortifications, and Taiwan has hidden mobile missile systems across the country designed to avoid detection. With thousands of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns, Taiwan could inflict heavy losses on Chinese forces before they even reached the main island. Even after making it ashore, they'd be looking at a fighting force of 1.2 million soldiers. With how densely populated the country is, Chinese forces would have to fight through cities block by block, as bombarding the entire country would defeat the goal of reunification. Given the extremely difficult and complex nature of China carrying out an amphibious invasion, all it would take is a relatively moderate amount of American disruption to thwart the entire Chinese operation. China's main weakness would be at the crossing of the 100-mile strait itself, during which time its fleet would be vulnerable to Taiwanese and American anti-ship missiles, and during the beach landing, Chinese infantry would be vulnerable to Taiwanese rocket artillery. Taiwan's Li-Ting shrapnel munitions were designed specifically for these beach defenses to spray over 300,000 steel balls at supersonic speeds with every single volley. and just the 2 American Pacific-based guided missile submarines alone would be able to fire 308 Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets within China, causing immense disruption to the Chinese invasion operations. A few dozen American nuclear subs would have enough torpedoes to sink over 400 Chinese ships. 42 of these submarines are part of the Pacific Fleet alone, and only a few dozen B-1 Lancer bombers would carry enough anti-ship missiles, 24 apiece, to sink over 500 Chinese ships. Just as a size comparison, all of this would only put a few thousand American lives at risk, far fewer than the 200,000 troops the US had in Iraq and Afghanistan at one point. China has said they have 3 red lines that, if crossed, would leave them with no choice but to invade. The first is if Taiwan tried to formally separate from China and become a sovereign state. Since China already considers the island part of the country, any formal independence effort could see Beijing mobilize its forces. The second red line is if Taiwan were to develop the capability to deter a Chinese invasion on their own, namely by trying to acquire nuclear weapons. This has been a contentious issue in the past. Taiwan has twice started clandestine nuclear programs, and the US has twice pushed Taiwan to shut them down, worrying it could prompt China to attack before the island comes close to acquiring the bomb. If only they knew, they could just watch our video on how to make a nuclear weapon. The third red line is if Beijing were to believe an outside power was getting too cozy with Taiwan. Yes, the US sells Taiwan billions in fighter jets, rocket launchers, and artillery, and even holds military exercises with Taiwanese forces. But that's a step below America, or another country like Japan, stationing its troops on the islands. China prefers to bully its neighbors, and the presence of a strong military close to its borders is seen as unacceptable. But what do you think? What are the odds China launches an invasion? And if they do, should the US intervene to protect Taiwanese independence? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, check out our video on what a Russian invasion of Ukraine would look like. And remember, there is always more to learn.